In the days of King Ahasuerus, who reigned over the vast Persian Empire from India to Ethiopia, there was a queen named Vashti. She was known for her beauty, but also for her strong will. One day, during a great feast, the king, in high spirits, commanded Vashti to appear before him and his guests so he could display her beauty. However, Vashti refused to come. Her defiance shocked the royal court, and the king, upon consulting his advisors, decided to remove Vashti as queen. This decree was sent throughout the empire to ensure that all women respected their husbands. After Vashti's removal, the king's attendants suggested that a search be conducted throughout the empire for a new queen. Beautiful young women were to be gathered, brought to the royal harem, and given beauty treatments before being presented to the king. Among these women was a young Jewish girl named Hadassah, more commonly known as Esther. Esther was an orphan, raised by her cousin Mordecai, a devout Jew who worked at the king's gate. She was a woman of grace and humility, and when she was taken to the palace, Mordecai advised her not to reveal her Jewish heritage. She followed his guidance, trusting that God was in control. Under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, Esther underwent 12 months of beauty treatments. She quickly won favor with Haggai, who provided her with the best treatments and assigned her 7 maids. When it was her turn to go before the king, she requested nothing except what Haggai recommended. Her humility and natural beauty captivated King Ahasuerus, and he loved her more than all the other women. He placed the royal crown upon her head and declared her queen in place of Vashti. A grand banquet was held in her honor, and gifts were sent throughout the provinces to celebrate the new queen. Meanwhile, Mordecai remained watchful over Esther. One day, while sitting at the king's gate, he overheard a plot by 2 of the king's officers, Bigthan and Teresh, who planned to assassinate the king. Mordecai informed Esther, who in turn relayed the message to Ahasuerus in Mordecai's name. The plot was investigated and found to be true, and the conspirators were executed. Mordecai's deed was recorded in the royal chronicles, though he received no immediate reward. During this time, a man named Haman rose to power as the king's chief official. He was an Agagite, a longtime enemy of the Jews, and he commanded that all people bow to him. However, Mordecai refused to bow, for he would bow only to God. This enraged Haman, and he devised a plan to destroy not only Mordecai, but all the Jews in the empire. Haman approached King Ahasuerus and accused the Jews of being disobedient to the king's laws. He convinced the king to issue a decree for their destruction, and the king, unaware of Esther's Jewish identity, granted Haman the authority to proceed. The decree was sent out, and the Jewish people were thrown into mourning. When Mordecai learned of the decree, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, crying out in the streets. News of this reached Esther, and she sent a messenger to inquire about his distress. Mordecai urged Esther to go before the king and plead for her people's lives. However, Esther feared for her life, for it was against the law to approach the king without being summoned. Anyone who did so would be put to death, unless the king extended his golden scepter. Mordecai's response to Esther was both firm and profound. He reminded her that she was not exempt from the decree, and that if she remained silent, deliverance for the Jews would arise from another place. But he also spoke these famous words, "And who knows, but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Strengthened by these words, Esther resolved to act. She asked Mordecai and the Jews to fast for 3 days, and she and her maids did the same. Then she declared, "I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." On the 3rd day, Esther dressed in her royal robes and entered the king's court. The moment was tense, but when King Ahasuerus saw her, he extended his golden scepter, sparing her life. He asked what she desired, and she invited the king and Haman to a banquet she had prepared. At the banquet, the king again asked Esther what her request was, promising her up to half the kingdom. Esther, exercising great wisdom, invited the king and Haman to another banquet the next day, promising to reveal her request then. That night, the king could not sleep. He ordered the royal chronicles to be read to him, and he was reminded of Mordecai's act of saving his life. Realizing that Mordecai had not been honored, the king asked Haman what should be done for a man the king wished to honor. Thinking the king meant him, Haman suggested a lavish public display where the man would be dressed in royal robes and led through the city on the king's horse. To Haman's horror, the king ordered him to do this for Mordecai. Haman, humiliated, carried out the king's orders. Meanwhile, he was summoned to Esther's second banquet. There, the king once more asked Esther what she desired. With great courage, Esther revealed Haman's plot against her people, exposing him as the enemy. The king, in a rage, left the banquet. Haman, realizing his doom, fell before Esther to beg for his life. When the king returned, he saw Haman falling at Esther's feet and mistook it for an assault. His fury intensified, and he ordered Haman to be executed on the very gallows that Haman had prepared for Mordecai. With Haman dead, Esther pleaded with the king to revoke the decree against the Jews. However, the laws of Persia could not be undone. Instead, the king issued a new decree allowing the Jews to defend themselves against their enemies. On the appointed day, the Jews triumphed over those who sought their destruction. Mordecai was promoted to a high position in the kingdom, and the Jews established the festival of Purim to commemorate their deliverance. Lessons from the story of Esther. God's timing is perfect. Esther was placed in a royal position for a purpose. Sometimes we may not understand why we are in certain situations, but God has a plan. Courage in the face of fear. Esther risked her life to save her people. Faith requires courage, especially when facing trials. Obedience and humility lead to favor. Esther listened to Mordecai's advice and showed humility, which led to her being favored by the king and ultimately saving her people. God uses ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Esther was an orphan, yet God raised her up to be queen. No matter our background, God can use us mightily. Standing firm in faith. Mordecai refused to bow to Haman, showing us that we should remain steadfast in our beliefs, even when pressured by the world. Divine reversals. What the enemy meant for harm, God turned into good. Haman's plot backfired, and Mordecai was elevated instead. Trust that God can turn any situation around. Fasting and prayer bring breakthroughs. Esther and the Jews fasted before she approached the king. Seeking God through fasting and prayer opens doors and brings divine intervention.